At 11 p.m., my neighbor texted me. She's on my porch. With him. I watched through the camera as my fiancé kissed him, then walked inside. At 11 p.m., my phone buzzed on the coffee table with a message from Clara, the neighbor across the courtyard. She never texted late. I picked it up and saw the line that set the night in motion. She's on my porch, with him. I opened the camera app tied to our shared security setup, the one that watched over the walkway between our buildings, and the feed snapped to life. The infrared washed everything in that flat gray tone that makes people look like cutouts. The figure in the long coat turned, and I recognized the posture, the habit of smoothing hair behind the ear, the lift of the chin. Melissa. She leaned on Clara's railing. A man stepped into the frame. They faced each other. The motion alert pushed a timestamp into the corner as they kissed. They didn't look around. They didn't whisper. They went straight inside. I sat back, and the room felt smaller. The apartment had the tidy, staged look of a place preparing for a wedding that now looked like a calendar error. Lists on the fridge. A box of envelopes. 2 suit bags at the coat rack, zipped and neat. I did not walk out. I did not call. I watched the feed blink to the closed door of Clara's unit and set the phone down, already building a plan in my head that did not involve shouting across a courtyard. I opened the shared cell plan account on my laptop and exported Melissa's last 3 months of call logs into a spreadsheet. The report populated with numbers and durations. I color-coded repeated entries, filtered by time of day, marked the late-night calls. One number appeared on a pattern that only made sense if a person kept a second life in the hours when normal schedules softened. Tuesdays, Thursdays, every other Sunday. I ran the number through a contact finder tied to my email, because people reuse information without thinking about it. A first name came back from an old group thread Melissa had archived years ago. Brandon. I searched my email for that name and hit on a single wedding guest list draft from months back. The name sat in a column with a question mark and no accompanying address. Not a stranger, then. Not someone new out of thin air. A leftover from a part of her life I had assumed ended when we started planning a future with caterers and deposit deadlines. I muted the camera feed and texted Clara a thank you. She did not add commentary. She did not ask what I planned to do. She sent a still frame pulled from her doorbell video with the angle I did not have. Melissa's hand on the man's chest right before they went in. The man kept his face turned away from the lens. The coat hood hid his profile. It did not matter. The number in my spreadsheet mattered. The rhythm of the calls mattered. The door opening and closing again 27 minutes later mattered. I went to the router admin page for our apartment and pulled the client list history. I had set it to log device names after a break-in on the street last winter. It kept a rolling list of whatever had touched our network, down to MAC addresses and timestamps. I filtered by dates when I had traveled for work. A device named Pixel_7 had connected for short bursts on 2 of those nights. Not Melissa's phone. Not mine. Melissa used an iPhone. I expanded the log and saw that device had connected once 2 months earlier for 16 minutes in the early afternoon on a day when she swore she had been at a dress fitting across town. The Pixel had used our guest network, which meant someone had been given the password rather than guessed it. That felt like a key turning in a lock I did not know existed. My chest went tight in a new way. I scrolled further. The same device had tried the network last week, failed, then succeeded on the second attempt. My guest network password had been set to a throwaway phrase about the wedding reception because guests would ask, and I wanted it easy to remember. It was written on a small chalkboard by the entry shelf for when friends stopped by. I took it down and wiped it clean without touching anything else. I kept the laptop open and staged windows the way I do for complex work tasks. Call logs. Router history. Camera feeds from the courtyard and our lobby. Rideshare history from Melissa's account, which still auto-synced to our shared budget app because convenience had once felt safe. A ride at 10:41 p.m. to our block. Drop-off point a few houses past Clara's place to avoid the exact camera I had just watched. I clicked through earlier rides. Patterns always look like noise until you put them on the same screen. The same driver ID had dropped her near the corner bodega 3 times in the last month at hours that did not match her claimed planning meetings. I wrote the driver ID down. I did not want a confrontation without proof that would survive a denial. I exported the camera clip and saved it. I took stills and embedded them into a 1-page document with timestamps and the call log graph beneath it. It looked clinical, almost like something prepared for an insurance adjuster. I wanted it that way. No moral sermon. Just a sequence of steps and the numbers that ran down the margins. Clara sent another still at 11:36 p.m. The man leaving alone. Melissa not in frame. No farewell on the porch. No pause. My gut told me she had moved through Clara's kitchen to the back stairs that fed into the alley to avoid coming back across the courtyard where my camera could catch her return. I pulled up a sidewalk map and marked the alley exits. I did not go after her. That part of me, the heated impulse, had sat down and yielded to the part that sees angles where people leave habits uncovered. At midnight, Melissa texted me that the meeting had run late, and she would be home after a quick stop for tea with a friend who had a crisis. The phrase read like something practiced. It had the tone of a message that someone sends to check a box in a storyline, then forgets to check whether the other person believes the premise. I typed a reply about a work deadline and set the phone down. I searched Brandon in public records. Names alone are meaningless in a city unless you pair them with something that attaches to real life. I added a university Melissa had once attended, an alumni database populated with archived newsletters, a photo of a fundraiser from 4 years ago. There he was at a folding table, laughing with a group of people in shirts with the department logo. Not famous, not notable, but visible enough that I knew he existed beyond my screen. I cross-referenced the fundraiser location with a list of tenants in that building. A small financial services firm shared a floor with the event space. The firm's site included staff bios with phone extensions. Brandon's headshot sat in a grid beside a phone number with the same last 4 digits as the one in my spreadsheet. I copied the entire bio page into a local file. The camera feed brightened slightly as a motion light across the courtyard clicked on at 12:18 a.m. Melissa reappeared on Clara's porch, alone. She kept her face pointed down, phone raised like a shield. She moved quick without running. She crossed the walkway and exited the frame. 30 seconds later, my own entry camera recorded the door opening. I listened for the sounds that tell the truth, even when people speak softly. A bag set down, keys on the dish, footsteps straight to the bathroom, a shower at a lower pressure setting than usual, like she wanted the sound to be there without the evidence of steam. The water ran for 6 minutes. The air stayed clear. I pulled a small hard drive from the desk drawer and began a backup of the phone data, the camera clips, the router logs. I labeled the folder with the date and the timestamp from Clara's first message. If anyone ever cast doubt on sequence, I wanted the sequence arranged in a way that did not require me to argue. The copying bar moved slow because the files were large. I watched the percentage crawl up while the shower stopped on the other side of the wall. At 12:41 a.m., her bank card pinged a transaction in our budget app for a rideshare at a time that did not match the pickup location. The ride had been ordered from the man's number earlier with a split fare. The app tried to hide that detail in a submenu, but the receipt itemized both parts when exported. I pulled it and saved it. She had split a fare that picked her up 4 blocks from Clara's place and dropped her at the corner by our building. The man had paid the larger share. People telegraph what they want hidden when they only cover the obvious angles. She exited the bathroom, moved quietly into the bedroom, and turned off the light without testing the usual small talk. Silence can be a confession when timed against data. I watched the feed's motion light turn off on Clara's porch and felt a shape I did not have a name for settle in my chest. Not grief. Not fury. Something more like a switch that stays down until you pull it up yourself. It felt wrong to sleep under the same roof with a folder like that on my desk, so I took a sweatshirt and sat in the kitchen with the laptop glow on the tiles. I scrolled back through the router logs, looking for anything I had missed. The Pixel device had not just connected at odd hours. It had also authenticated once using the main network, named months ago before I set the guest network rule, which meant the device had been in the apartment long enough to catch the primary password when it lived on the chalkboard by the door during a small game night. That narrowed the list of suspects to people who had stepped inside with permission at least once. I pulled up photos from that night to see who had come by. In a group shot near the window, I found a man standing half-turned toward the camera with a grin that looked rehearsed. He wore the same thin cord bracelet on his left wrist that I had paused on in the fundraiser photo. The bracelet had a small metal bead near the knot. The same hand position. The same casual tilt. He had been in our apartment 6 months ago, smiling into a room that included me, tapping into a network I paid for with a password I had written in chalk while I fetched ice from the freezer. The mind-blowing part arrived not as a dramatic discovery, but as a quiet string that pulled a larger curtain. The Pixel_7 device ID matched the device that had once used our apartment's smart lock app to request temporary access. I had forgotten that feature existed because we stopped using it after the first month. The app kept an archive. Someone had generated a temporary code labeled with a generic tag that did not belong to me. The request had come in on a Thursday afternoon while Melissa was trying on dresses. The code had been used once that same afternoon and expired automatically. I stared at that line of text and felt the room tilt. This was not only a kiss on a porch and a late-night ride. This was a person who had already crossed our threshold because a door had been opened for him in a way that felt practiced. He had not guessed. He had not broken. He had been allowed. I closed the laptop and let the plan reshape itself. I did not need an argument. I needed a clean record, a timeline with artifacts that could not be waved off as jealousy. I needed allies positioned where denial would crash into facts. I texted Clara one sentence and asked her to keep everything she had without sending anything further. She agreed. I scheduled a meeting through the financial firm's contact form for a pre-wedding consultation under a burner email, knowing the calendar would tell me if Brandon still used his own desk. I set a reminder to call the driver from the rideshare receipts in the morning and ask very specific questions that people answer when asked with confidence. I shut off the kitchen light at 2:03 a.m. and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the chalkboard where the password used to be. The slate was clean. The apartment was quiet. The folder on my hard drive held a small, growing city of files named by time. I slept on the couch because distance helped me think straight. The next morning I woke with the kind of alertness that doesn't come from coffee. The night before had already handed me more than a suspicion. It had given me a framework. Now I just needed to start attaching weight to it. Melissa's breathing from the bedroom was steady and slow when I slipped out with my laptop bag. I didn't want her to hear the front door. I wanted her to think I was still asleep when she left for her supposed florist meeting later. At 8:15 a.m., I parked 2 streets away from her usual cafe and sat where I could watch the entrance without being seen. By 8:37, she walked in, not in the outfit she'd laid out the night before for vendor appointments, but in a sweater and jeans that looked better suited for a casual day off. She ordered, scanned the room, and sat alone at a corner table. No laptop, no planner. She spent 30 minutes scrolling her phone before heading out the back door. I followed on foot, staying on the opposite side of the street. She walked 2 blocks before getting into a gray sedan. I recognized the man in the driver's seat instantly from Clara's porch footage. Brandon. He didn't linger. He pulled into traffic and turned toward the east end of the city, away from any wedding venue or florist I knew she'd visited before. I didn't follow the car too closely. I stayed just far enough back to keep them in sight without inviting suspicion. They pulled into an underground parking lot for a mid-tier hotel near the river. I knew the brand, corporate clients, private elevators from the garage, discreet staff. I made a mental note of the exact time they went in. I left before they came back out, heading instead for the hotel employee entrance. That's where I waited for Simon, an old friend from college who now worked front desk security at this chain. He wasn't expecting me, but when he saw my face, his eyes narrowed in recognition. I didn't explain over the phone. I waited until we were in his small, camera-filled office. I slid a slip of paper across the desk with the time, date, and Brandon's name. Simon leaned back, scanned the lobby camera archive, and then cross-referenced it with the garage feed. He didn't give me the footage, company rules, but he confirmed that Melissa and Brandon had entered together, taken the elevator, and left exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes later. She hadn't been wearing the sweater when she left. By 11 a.m., I had enough for a chain. Neighbors' porch footage, call logs, router history, rideshare receipts, and now confirmation of a hotel meeting. But I wanted depth. I wanted their pattern mapped out so thoroughly that any excuse she tried would collapse before it started. That afternoon, I called the rideshare driver whose ID kept appearing on her trips. I introduced myself in a neutral, polite way, as though I were confirming a charge on a shared account. People talk more freely when they think you're not accusing them of anything. The driver was relaxed, even cheerful. Yes, he'd driven her multiple times, often dropping her at the corner past Clara's house. Sometimes she was alone, sometimes the man from last night was with her. The driver even mentioned she'd once joked about avoiding her neighbor's cameras when asked why she didn't want to be dropped right in front. I asked if he remembered where he'd picked her up the night before. He gave me a street name 2 blocks from Brandon's apartment building. That was enough to justify my next step. I pulled the building's management company info from public records and called pretending to be confirming a package delivery. All I needed was to hear if Brandon was still listed as a resident. The receptionist didn't even hesitate. Yes, apartment 4B. That told me his home base. By the end of the day, I had 3 clear meeting locations: Clara's porch, the East End Hotel, and Brandon's apartment. I also had dates that lined up with Melissa's wedding planning appointments. Patterns were easier to see now. Tuesdays and Thursdays were her favorites, and Sunday afternoons when I was watching football with friends. She was efficient. Her calls to Brandon were always short and frequent, no meandering chats, which suggested they used other channels for detail. I pulled Melissa's social media into the mix. Her posts were boring and sanitized, shots of floral arrangements, ring selfies, brunch plates. But in the background of one brunch photo from 2 weeks ago, I noticed a reflection in the cafe window. A man in a gray jacket, his head tilted down, sat facing her table. Not directly visible, but his build matched Brandon's. It was a small thing, but it added another unguarded moment to the pattern. That evening, Clara stopped by under the pretense of borrowing a baking dish. We talked in the kitchen, low voices, doors closed. She admitted she'd seen Melissa with Brandon more than a handful of times, often at hours that didn't match her schedule. Clara's boyfriend, who lived with her part-time, had also noticed, but they hadn't wanted to get involved until last night's scene. Clara agreed to keep watching, offering to text me timestamps whenever Melissa showed up at her place with him. The next opportunity came faster than I expected. 2 nights later, at 9:12 p.m., Clara texted, "They're back." I opened the live feed and watched Melissa and Brandon slip inside her apartment. This time, Melissa had a large overnight bag slung over her shoulder. She was laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months, free, loud, like she'd stepped out of her life entirely. I took a screenshot, noted the time, and went back to the feed every 20 minutes. At 11:45, Brandon left alone, the bag still inside. Melissa didn't leave until the following morning, exiting through the alley in sunglasses and a hoodie. By now, I had more than suspicion. I had timestamps, locations, cross-confirmation from 3 different sources, and physical proof from camera stills. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. If I moved too early, she could spin this into some palatable lie, involve her parents, maybe even turn it into an attack on my trust issues. I wanted her cornered, with nowhere to pivot, and for the fallout to be so public that she couldn't quietly rewrite the story later. I started laying the groundwork. Quietly, I made sure her parents would be in town the following week. I set up a casual group dinner for close friends, framed as a pre-wedding get-together. And I coordinated with Clara to make sure Melissa and Brandon would be lured to the exact spot I wanted at the exact time. The web was almost ready, and all I needed was for them to walk into it on their own. The week leading up to the confrontation felt like loading a spring. Every step had to be timed so that when it snapped, there was no chance for her to wriggle free. I'd invited Melissa's parents, Harold and Elaine, under the pretense of a small pre-wedding dinner at our place on Saturday. I told them it would be casual, a chance for close friends to see the dress, sample the catering menu, and toast the final weeks before the ceremony. They were excited, especially Harold, who had been vocal about wanting to be more involved in the preparations. Melissa didn't suspect a thing. She even gushed about her appointments that week, saying she'd be meeting the photographer Thursday and a decorator Friday. I knew exactly where she'd really be. Clara texted me Thursday night. Melissa and Brandon had been in her apartment for over an hour. I didn't record this one. I didn't need more footage. The stack I already had was enough to bury her in front of a room full of people. The final piece was luring her and Brandon into position on Saturday. Clara agreed to play her part. Around 4 p.m. that day, she texted Melissa asking for help moving a heavy piece of furniture before her boyfriend got home. She framed it as urgent, the kind of favor a neighbor would only ask if they really trusted someone. Melissa replied that she'd pop over before getting ready for the dinner. I wasn't surprised she planned to stop by Brandon's place first. It was only 2 streets away, and then head to Clara's. My guess was that she'd bring him with her, thinking they'd sneak in a short visit before she came home to change. Meanwhile, I had my own guests arriving. Harold and Elaine showed up first, followed by 2 of our mutual friends, a groomsman, and my cousin who lived nearby. Everyone thought they were there to celebrate. I offered drinks, kept the mood light, and watched the clock. At 5:23 p.m., Clara texted, "They're here." She included a still from her door camera showing Melissa and Brandon standing together on her porch. Melissa wore jeans and a sweater, hair tied back, looking comfortable and unhurried. Brandon's hand was on her lower back. They walked inside without knocking. That was my cue. I gathered everyone in our apartment and told them I wanted to show them something before dinner. They followed me across the courtyard to Clara's unit. She had already unlocked her door and was waiting inside the front hall, silent. I walked them into the living room. There they were, Melissa and Brandon, mid-conversation, their expressions freezing as they registered the group, standing in the doorway. Melissa's face went pale. Brandon straightened but didn't move toward the door. Harold's eyes darted between them, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to piece it together. Elaine clapped a hand to her mouth, stunned. Melissa stammered something about helping a neighbor, but the tone was wrong, the setting wrong, and her body language screamed guilt. Brandon tried to smooth it over, saying he'd just stopped by to help carry something heavy. No one in the room bought it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small folder, and handed it to Harold. Inside were the stills from Clara's porch, the hotel receipts, the rideshare logs, and a summary timeline that linked every date and time. Harold's jaw tightened as he turned each page. Elaine's eyes filled with disbelief that shifted quickly into anger. Melissa tried to grab the folder from him, but Harold stepped back. His voice was low, but the fury in it was unmistakable. He demanded to know how long this had been going on. She said nothing. Brandon shifted his weight like he was preparing to leave, But Clara's boyfriend had appeared in the hallway, arms crossed, blocking the exit. The tension in that room was electric. My cousin broke it by asking Brandon if he'd enjoyed the hotel stays. That's when Melissa's composure cracked. She lunged at me, saying I had set her up. I just told her everything in that folder was a record of her own actions. No setups, no tricks, just facts. Harold announced that the wedding was off. Elaine added that they would not be funding any of Melissa's expenses from that moment on. That landed harder than anything I could have said. Melissa's entire lifestyle depended on their financial support. Brandon looked from her to me and seemed to realize this was not going to be swept under a rug. She turned on him, hissing something I couldn't hear, and he walked toward the door. Clara's boyfriend stepped aside just enough to let him out. Melissa followed, but Harold blocked her and told her she wasn't welcome at the dinner. I didn't stop them from leaving. The point wasn't to hold her there. The point was to end it in front of every witness whose opinion she valued, with no escape route for her story. The air in the room after they left was heavy, but I felt an odd kind of clarity. The trap had worked. Now it was time for the fallout. When the door closed behind Melissa, the silence in Clara's living room was the kind you only hear after something irreversible. Harold stood frozen with the folder still in his hand, staring at the last page like it might explain why his daughter had just dismantled her own engagement. Elaine looked smaller, as though the air had been pulled out of her. My cousin, Simon, and the others shifted awkwardly until I suggested we go back to my apartment. Back inside, Harold asked me to walk him through the proof again. I laid it out step by step, not dramatizing it, just letting the evidence speak. The call logs, the camera stills, the rideshare receipts, the hotel confirmation. I explained how Clara had been quietly helping, how each piece of evidence overlapped, leaving no gaps she could exploit. When I finished, Harold nodded once, his jaw clenched. He said he would handle the rest with her directly, and I could tell from his tone that handling it meant something final. Word started spreading faster than I'd expected. Melissa must have called a friend to vent, because by the next morning one of her bridesmaids texted me asking if the rumor about her and the guy from college was true. I didn't reply with a story. I just sent her the same folder I'd given Harold. Within hours, 3 more people reached out, each one saying they had no idea. I knew at least one of them had known and kept quiet, but I didn't care about sorting the enablers from the clueless. The important thing was the story being consistent no matter who told it. That afternoon, Harold called me. His voice was heavy but steady. He and Elaine had confronted Melissa, and she'd admitted to seeing Brandon for months. She tried to claim it wasn't serious and that she'd been stressed by the wedding, but Harold shut it down. He told her they were pulling all financial support, the apartment she lived in before moving in with me, her car, even the boutique business venture they'd been quietly funding. Without them, she'd have to find her own way. Elaine, who'd always defended her, had apparently told her she was on her own this time. By the end of the week, the fallout widened. A mutual friend sent me a screenshot from Brandon's work website. His profile was gone. A quick search showed his company had a strict code of conduct against personal relationships with current or prospective clients. Melissa had been listed as a client contact for the boutique's financial services. Whether Harold had called them or the company figured it out themselves, the result was the same. Brandon was unemployed. Melissa tried reaching out once, a short, sharp text accusing me of ruining her life and warning me that I'd regret it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The only thing I did was forward that message to Harold, so he'd have another data point in the record. I kept the apartment. Harold insisted on covering the last of the joint lease costs, so I wouldn't be on the hook for her share. Clara and I talked more in the weeks that followed, and she admitted she'd been worried this would blow back on her, but instead people in the building seemed to respect how quietly and cleanly we'd handled it. Melissa moved out of state within a month. I heard from someone who knew someone that she was working retail and sharing an apartment with 2 other people to make rent. Brandon's name popped up in a minor news story months later about a failed investment scheme. A footnote in the business section that didn't surprise me in the least. For me, life settled into something better than I'd expected. I didn't have to walk around wondering anymore. I had answers, proof, and a clean break. And I knew that when I decided to end it, I hadn't just burned the bridge. I'd made sure she had no way to rebuild it behind my back. The spring had snapped, and it had landed exactly where I'd aimed it. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.